What if Iraq's biggest problem was not Saddam Hussein or the 2003 invasion, but the way the country was created in the first place? By the end of this video, you will understand why Iraq's instability cannot be explained by one war, one leader, or one invasion, but by a century of borders, oil, power struggles, and foreign intervention. To ask if Iraq was built to fail is not to pass a final verdict on its destiny, but to examine a historical design. No single war, dictator, or foreign intervention can explain a century of instability. Instead, the roots trace back to a massive structural challenge, the assembly of a modern state before a unified national identity had the chance to form. This process began with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. For centuries, the region existed as three distinct Ottoman provinces: Mosul in the north, Baghdad in the center, and Basra in the south. In May 1916, before the fighting even ended, British diplomat Mark Sykes and French diplomat François-Georges Picot secretly negotiated the partition of the Middle East. By April 1920, the San Remo Conference formalized this division, granting Great Britain the League of Nations mandate for Mesopotamia. British interests in this new territory were highly strategic. London sought to secure its overland trade routes, safeguard the vital transport passage to British India, and guarantee early access to newly discovered oil fields. By joining the three diverse provinces of Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra under a single administration, Britain created the geographic core of modern Iraq. It was a rapid, top-down construction of a state, executed to serve foreign imperial priorities rather than local cohesion. Within these newly defined borders lay a highly complex human geography. Arab Shia Muslims formed the largest population group, concentrated primarily across the southern plains. In the central plains and cities, Arab Sunnis held most of the military, administrative, and government roles. To the north, the Kurds maintained a distinct national identity, complete with their own language and culture. Interspersed among these major groups were smaller communities with ancient roots in the region, including Turkmen, Assyrians, Yazidis, and Christians. While many accounts blame this diverse mix for Iraq's subsequent instability, diversity itself was not the cause. The actual challenge lay in the design of the state's institutions. From the very beginning, the government failed to build public institutions that felt inclusive enough to earn the trust of all major communities. Instead of establishing a system of shared power and broad representation, the state centralized authority in a way that favored some groups while marginalizing others. When institutions lack legitimacy, trust breaks down, leaving raw power and coercion as the only tools to keep a state together. In March 1921, at the Cairo Conference, British colonial officials decided on a shortcut to political legitimacy. To pacify the population after a bloody rebellion, they chose Faisal bin Hussein, an outsider from Mecca who had recently been expelled from Syria, to lead a new constitutional monarchy. Gertrude Bell and High Commissioner Sir Percy Cox orchestrated his coronation in August 1921, presenting Faisal as the unifying ruler of the three joined provinces. But the new crown carried a severe deficit of local trust. Many Iraqis viewed the monarchy as an instrument of British imperial control. The security of the throne relied on British military support, which used air power to suppress persistent tribal revolts and regional uprisings throughout the Mandate era. This dependency was written into the state's foundations through the 1930 Anglo-Iraqi Treaty. Though this agreement cleared the path for Iraq to join the League of Nations as an independent state on October 3, 1932, the sovereignty was highly conditional. The treaty guaranteed Britain long-term military transit rights and control over strategic air bases, including Habanaya. By tying the survival of the ruling elite to foreign military power, the Mandate era created a fragile state architecture, leaving the young kingdom's institutions isolated from its own citizens. The geopolitical value of the young state shifted with the development of its vast petroleum reserves. In the decades following independence, oil transformed Iraq from an agricultural territory into one of the most economically significant nations in the Middle East. On June 1, 1972, the government nationalized the foreign-owned Iraq Petroleum Company, placing resource wealth directly under central control. This measure concentrated immense financial power in Baghdad. Instead of relying on traditional taxation of citizens, the ruling elite funded the state through direct petroleum revenues. This centralized income financed rapid domestic modernization. The government built highways, expanded electricity grids, and established free public education and healthcare systems, while simultaneously funding a massive expansion of the military. But this concentrated wealth fundamentally changed the incentives of governance. Because the central state controlled the oil, and the oil generated almost all national revenue, whoever held the capital controlled the entire economy. The state itself became the ultimate prize. This structural dynamic intensified competition among domestic factions while giving foreign governments, international corporations, and regional rivals a direct, permanent interest in who ruled Baghdad. On July 14, 1958, a military coup led by General Abdul Karim Qasim abolished the monarchy, executing the royal family in Baghdad. This violent transition ended the British-installed dynasty and initiated 20 years of coups and political instability. The struggle for control of the government ended in July 1968 when the Ba'ath Party seized power. Within this new administration, a young party member named Saddam Hussein built a highly effective internal security apparatus. By the time Saddam formally assumed the presidency on July 16, 1979, he had constructed a total surveillance state. The regime enforced social order through the Mukhabarat, the state intelligence agency, which systematically imprisoned, tortured, and executed political opponents. Oil revenues financed modern schools, paved highways, and free healthcare, creating a visible wave of economic development. Yet this modernization came with a steep price. The state provided material benefits to citizens who remained loyal, while entirely excluding and punishing those suspected of dissent. This system of governance achieved temporary stability through raw force, leaving the country's deep communal divisions unresolved and hidden beneath a system of fear. In September 1980, seeking to capitalize on the chaos of the Iranian Revolution, Saddam Hussein launched an invasion of Iran. The resulting war dragged on for 8 brutal years, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives and draining the treasury. Iraq emerged from the conflict with a modernized military and over $80 billion in foreign debt. Pressured by this economic ruin, Saddam made another gamble in August 1990, invading neighboring Kuwait to seize its oil wealth. A United States-led coalition quickly expelled Iraqi forces in the Gulf War, but the aftermath brought a different kind of devastation. Throughout the 1990s, United Nations sanctions crippled the civilian economy. While the regime maintained its security apparatus, public infrastructure collapsed, clean water became scarce, and basic medical supplies vanished. This decade of isolation hollowed out the state from within. By the dawn of the 21st century, before foreign soldiers crossed the border in 2003, Iraq's institutions and public welfare systems were already fractured and severely exhausted. Following the attacks of September 11, 2001, Iraq rapidly shifted to the center of United States foreign policy. In March 2003, a US-led coalition launched an invasion, building its public case around the threat of alleged weapons of mass destruction and the necessity of regime change. While coalition forces quickly toppled Saddam Hussein's government, subsequent investigations by the Iraq Survey Group, chaired by Charles Duelfer, concluded that Baghdad had dismantled its active chemical, biological, and nuclear programs after the 1991 Gulf War, leaving no active stockpiles at the time of the invasion. With the old government gone, the newly formed Coalition Provisional Authority assumed administrative control of the country and immediately implemented 2 highly contested policy decisions. First, it issued Order No. 2, which completely dissolved the Iraqi military. Second, it executed a broad de-Baathification campaign, removing thousands of civil servants, doctors, teachers, and experienced administrators from their posts due to their nominal affiliation with the ruling party. These measures ignited immediate global debate. Supporters of the administration's policy argued that these sweeping steps were necessary to thoroughly dismantle the old regime's power structure and prevent the resurgence of Ba'athist influence. Conversely, critics contended that these decisions went too far, stripping the fragile state of its essential operating machinery, administrative expertise, and domestic security forces. By dismantling the country's existing military and civic infrastructure, these policies removed a dictator while simultaneously creating a profound security and administrative vacuum at the very center of the Iraqi state. The sudden dissolution of the state's security apparatus left hundreds of thousands of armed, unemployed men on the streets. In this void, power defaulted to whoever could project force. Local neighborhoods and tribal networks organized their own defense, which rapidly fractured along sectarian lines. Armed groups and militias filled the administrative vacuum, offering localized security and basic services that the central government could no longer provide. By 2004, these factions became the primary authorities on the ground, funding their operations through smuggling, protection rackets, and foreign patronage. During this chaos, Jordanian militant Abu Musab al-Zarqawi established Al-Qaeda in Iraq. The group targeted Shia civilians, international forces, and government recruits, intentionally seeking to ignite a sectarian war. The bombing of the golden-domed Al-Askari shrine in Samarra on February 22, 2006 shattered any remaining social cohesion, triggering waves of retaliatory killings. With no trusted national institutions to broker peace, citizens looked to sectarian paramilitaries for survival. This violence organized itself around the complete absence of a credible state, leaving local communities traumatized and making long-term civic recovery incredibly difficult. In 2011, the outbreak of the Syrian civil war across the western border accelerated Iraq's internal decay. The porous boundary, drawn decades prior, allowed fighters, weapons, and resources to flow freely between the two conflicts. Within this security vacuum, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, known as ISIS, rapidly expanded. The group grew directly from the vulnerabilities of a hollowed-out state. In June 2014, ISIS militants swept across the border and captured Mosul, Iraq's second-largest city, as divisions within the National Army led to a rapid military collapse. The group declared a caliphate from the historic Al-Nuri Mosque. The threat forced a massive mobilization of local and international forces. A coalition of Iraqi security forces, Kurdish Peshmerga, local allies, and US-led air support launched a grueling counteroffensive. Over the next 3 years, these forces systematically reclaimed territory. By July 2017, Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi arrived in a devastated Mosul to declare full liberation. ISIS had lost almost all of its territorial control, but the physical ruin of the north left a clear reminder of how easily extremist forces could exploit a state with weak institutional foundations. The territorial defeat of ISIS did not restore central authority. Instead, it exposed a deeply fractured state. Iraq became an arena of competing power centers rather than a single sovereign nation. In Baghdad in the south, Iran consolidated its influence, building ties with major political parties and supporting powerful armed groups. In the north, the Kurdistan regional government operated with its own parliament, laws, and security forces, the Peshmerga. This domestic division invited continuous foreign intervention. Turkey established over 100 military outposts inside northern Iraq, launching cross-border campaigns like Operation Clawlock. Concurrently, the United States maintained thousands of troops on the ground, shifting its objectives over 2 decades from occupation to advisory missions and regional containment. Today, whoever rules Baghdad must balance these rival foreign pressures and armed domestic factions. This fragmented reality shows how structural fault lines continue to challenge the country's survival. Subscribe to our channel for more in-depth geopolitical breakdowns. Against these compounding crises, the state did not dissolve. Iraqis continued to hold national elections, voting in successive parliamentary cycles after the adoption of the 2005 Constitution. This constitutional system, while highly contested, established a federal structure that kept the country's diverse regions within a single legal entity. On the ground, recovery slowly took shape. Security institutions were systematically rebuilt, and the Ministry of Peshmerga Affairs advanced a major reform plan to merge fragmented regional brigades into a unified command structure. In ruined urban centers like Mosul, local initiatives and international aid programs slowly restored schools, hospitals, and basic water grids. This physical reconstruction was funded by a massive resurgence in energy exports. Following the devastation of the war against ISIS, Iraq rebuilt its energy sector, restoring oil production to over 4 million barrels per day. Yet, this economic recovery remains hostage to structural obstacles. The country's wealth continues to bypass the general population, trapped in patronage networks that fuel severe political fragmentation and leave young Iraqis facing widespread unemployment. Baghdad still faces intense regional pressure, balancing its sovereignty against the competing interests of neighboring capitals. The modern history of Iraq is a record of ongoing endurance. The institutions of the Iraqi state remain vulnerable, and the historical borders drawn a century ago continue to shape its internal struggles. But the country persists, adapting to its systemic structural challenges while its people continuously work to build their future. Today, Iraq's future is written not by colonial cartographers, but by its own resilient citizens. This fragile foundation of borders and oil never guaranteed failure. It simply raised the cost of survival. As the nation navigates modern regional pressures, its endurance proves that statehood is a continuous struggle, not a static design. Subscribe for more deep geopolitical analysis.